Good afternoon. This hearing will come to order. Please have a seat. I want to welcome everyone to today's hearing on VA's efforts to modernize its medical supply chain. Ordering, stocking, and locating medical equipment and supplies are fundamental to VA's mission of providing medical care to our veterans. Unfortunately, these logistics functions seem to have degenerated in recent years. We read about them in the press on a regular basis. The Real-Time Location System, or RTLS, and Catamaran point-of-use projects were conceived as technological leaps forward, enabling VA medical centers to manage logistics more efficiently. Catamaran was intended to replace the 25-year-old Generic Inventory Package, or GIP, VA's primary inventory system. Catamaran included modern point-of-use capabilities and analytics tools, and a $55 million contract was awarded in September 2013 with a potential value of $275 million. Expectations were high, and VA began pilot implementations in 22 facilities, including Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, early results were overwhelmingly negative. In Pittsburgh, users reported the software was plagued by login failures, slow loading times, malfunctions, and problems integrating with Vista. Catamaran was generally cumbersome and inefficient, not any better than the existing inventory system. In 2015, the Pittsburgh Medical Center decided to revert to GIP. That eventually happened after the VA central office originally ordered Catamaran to remain in place, but eventually relented. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Catamaran was similarly unsuccessful. The Office of Inspector General has demonstrated that, unlike in Pittsburgh, the D.C. Medical Center's logistics operation was already in disarray before Catamaran came along. The staff had largely abandoned GIP and fallen into a pattern of tracking inventory manually in a disconnected fashion in various areas of the hospital. It remains a matter of debate to what extent Catamaran was ever used in D.C., up until VA halted the project and terminated the contract in August of 2016. What is clear is Catamaran was a harmful distraction. OIG has reported that logistics at the D.C. Medical Center got worse due to a variety of factors in 2015 and 16 during the Catamaran implementation that occurred. The subcommittee has determined that logistics operations are actually in worse shape today than they were before Catamaran began. I hope to determine the reasons for this today. I will now turn to the real-time location system, which is still ongoing. The Rtls project entails attaching radio frequency identification tags to a range of medical equipment, some supplies, and surgical instruments in the catheterization lab and the sterile processing department. With Rtls, VA aims to count and track the physical locations of these assets in real time on one computer screen. VA awarded the Rtls contract, which originally had a potential value of $543 million, in June of 2012. After a series of modifications, the contract is scheduled to end next month. An initial pilot in VISN 23 in the Northern Great Plains very quickly became an implementation throughout nearly the whole country before test results had ever come back from VISN 23. The test results in March 2015 were troubling. There were over 200 defects, and the Rtls could only track equipment accurately 40% of the time. This led to conflict between VA and the contractor. Specifically, VA threatened to terminate the contract if a satisfactory corrective action plan was not produced. Over a year later, in June 2016, there were still almost 50 defects. The contractor blamed VA's inadequate Wi-Fi, and VISN 23 withdrew from the project. According to the OIG, there were also cybersecurity deficiencies. The contractor connected Rtls to VA's network before receiving authority to operate. In September 2016, VA and the contractor signed a global settlement agreement that remains sealed. I requested a copy on April 12th, and the VA has so far declined to provide it. But what we do know is the contract was extended through June 18. Its requirements were significantly reduced, and the contractor was released from any liability for its performance up to that point. The facility slated to receive the Rtls asset tracking capability, its main components were cut from 92 to 47. The facilities scheduled to receive Rtls in the catheterization labs and sterile processing departments were also pared down. The temperature monitoring component of Rtls was almost completely eliminated. Today, VA still has a significant amount of work to do to meet even these reduced goals. The question before us today is what should be done with the Rtls program? How much has been spent, and what has the VA gotten for the money? The goalposts have been lowered, but can they be met, and how much additional investment will that require? The contract's expiration is only weeks away. I now yield to Ms. Rice, who has graciously agreed to fill in for Ranking Member Custer for any opening statement or remarks she may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, and I want to thank the Chairman for holding this important hearing. I also want to thank all of our witnesses for coming here today. I continue to be alarmed at the number of mismanaged and failed information technology programs at VA. Attempts to modernize VA's IT infrastructure always seems to hit implementation roadblocks, cost overruns, and result in products that are unusable for the frontline employees entrusted with delivering health care and benefits to our veterans. It is not surprising that IT is one of the 5 areas of concern GAO identified when it decided to place the Veterans Health Administration on its high-risk list. In its testimony today, the Office of Inspector General yet again finds that VA faces significant challenges in managing its IT development projects. Whether it is VA's inability to manage its medical supply inventory at the Washington, D.C. VA Medical Center, too many false starts on an interoperable electronic health record with DoD, and now the delayed signing of the contract with Cerner, or even delayed deployment of the caregiver IT system, it seems VA witnesses frequently shift the blame on the Office of Information and Technology during oversight hearings when things go wrong. As late as March of this year, the D.C. VAMC was still delaying treatment for veterans due to medical supply shortages. It has been over a year since Congresswoman Custer led committee members on an oversight visit to the D.C. VAMC after the OIG reported that patients were being put at risk due to care delays. This site visit revealed that supplies were not being tracked by any inventory management system or any automated system to process sterile supplies, not the JIP system, nor the Rtls, the real-time location service, nor Catamaran system. Due to failed management of Rtls and Catamaran, the medical center did not know when it was running low on some supplies, and in other cases was ordering too many supplies that remained unused. It took extra dedication and commitment from clinical staff to ensure no patients were harmed. However, veterans sometimes had procedures delayed or canceled. This significantly increased patients' risk of harm, in part due to a failed IT project that made it difficult for the medical center to manage its medical supply chain and ensure sterile equipment was processed and available to providers when they needed it to treat patients. OIG found in its review of the Rtls system, the Rtls project, that due to inadequate project management, VA did not have assurance that it received an effective return on the $451 million it invested in Rtls, or that Hewlett-Packard met the contract requirements because the contract was mismanaged. This mismanagement caused delays in veterans' care and wasted taxpayer dollars. It is beyond unacceptable. We are holding a hearing today to get the necessary facts so we can be sure that VA is properly managing its medical supply chain. We cannot have what happened at the D.C. VAMC take place in other VA hospitals and clinics around the country. According to the OIG, VA needs enhanced discipline, oversight, and resource management to support successful IT development. I look forward to hearing from VA about how the agency plans to enforce discipline, resource management, and ensure proper oversight so we can get this project back on track and prevent any future risk of harm for our veterans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Rice. I now welcome the members of our first and only panel who are seated at the witness table. With us today from VA, we have Ms. Tammy Zarnecki, the Assistant Deputy Undersecretary for Health for Administrative Operations in the Veterans Health Administration. She is accompanied by Mr. Alan Constantian, the Deputy Chief Information Officer and the Account Manager for Health in the Office of Information and Technology. Also on the panel, we have Mr. Nicholas Dahl, Deputy Assistant Inspector General for Audits and Evaluations, representing the VA Office of Inspector General. He is accompanied by Mr. Michael Bowman, the Director for the Information Technology and Security Audits Division in the Office of Inspector General. I ask that the witnesses please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear, under the penalty of perjury, that the testimony you are about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that all witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Ms. Zarnecki, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Bergman, Acting Ranking Member Rice, and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Department of Veterans Affairs Real-Time Location Project and the Point of Use Program. I'm accompanied today by Dr. Alan Constantian, Deputy Chief Information Office, Office of Information and Technology. In 2011, VA chartered several major transformation initiatives. 2 of these initiatives included Rtls Project and the Point of Use Program. The Rtls Project was chartered to automate processes and improve healthcare services that VA provides to veterans. In June of 2012, VA awarded a contract to Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Systems. The contract scope encompassed design, installation, testing, and maintenance of Rtls. Task orders were to be issued against the contract, which had a ceiling of $543 million. The Rtls project is jointly managed by OINT and VHA per a Memorandum of Understanding signed in 2011 by the Undersecretary for Health and the Chief Information Officer. The Rtls solution utilizes COTS technology and software to directly support patient care delivery and outcomes. Rtls requires extensive infrastructure to be installed throughout the hospital, with design and installation generally taking 1 to 2 years. Fargo VA-MC was the first site to complete installation and test the system in March of 2015. VA identified several issues, and the contractor was charged to correct them. In September of 2016, VA made a program decision to realign the Rtls program and entered into negotiations with a shared goal to expedite the implementation of Rtls. To capture the agreements made during these negotiations, VA modified the existing Rtls contract and executed a global settlement agreement, resulting in an implementation strategy to decouple the applications, allowing each application to be tested and deployed on their own schedule. Additionally, it was agreed that the vendor would install additional technology to improve the accuracy, and a new deployment schedule was issued through 2018. The deployment of Rtls was accelerated with many positive outcomes continuing through present. The sterile processing solution has been successfully implemented at 60 facilities, with over 1.4 million surgical and dental instruments being tracked. VA can be assured instruments have been through the required steps of the sterilization process, and the right instruments are being delivered to the right operating room for the right procedure. Also, in the cath lab solution has been deployed at 28 facilities and is generating notable supply savings. VHA and OINT have continued to align and improve project management processes following the conclusion and the publication of the OIG report. The Rtls deployment efforts have been managed utilizing sound project management principles. VA will perform continual risk assessments to assure that risks associated with deploying Rtls on the VA network are minimized. Moving to the point of use program. A point of use system provides asset visibility down to the point at which the asset is used. VA defines our point of use as our medical supply rooms located throughout the medical center. The point of use program was envisioned and intended to provide an integrated supply chain solution capable of providing consolidated data. The consolidated data would be used to effectively manage consumable medical supply inventories throughout the hospital. Shipcom Wireless was awarded the point-of-use contract on September 23rd of 2013. While the first and second options of the contract were exercised, contract requirements were not being met. The contract was not meeting operational or contractual deliverables, and after further review and based on a new return on investment analysis, it was determined that the point-of-use program would not see a break-even in the investment for over a decade. These figures were deemed unsustainable, and the decision was made to not to exercise future option periods of the contract. A plan has been derived to transition the 22 sites that had converted to Shipcom's Catamaran system, including the DCVA, back to the VA's generic inventory package. In January and February of 2017, the point-of-use program team traveled to the sites to educate the staff on a tool to transition the data. RTLS has made significant improvements in the efficiency and safety of healthcare for our veterans. It's critical that we continue to move forward with the gains that we have made thus far. Your continued support is essential to providing care for veterans and families. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony. My colleagues and I are prepared to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Zarnecki. Mr. Dahl, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman Rice, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today. The focus of my comments are on the OIG's review of whether VA effectively managed the Rtls project to meet cost and schedule targets and performance and security needs. OIG audits in recent years established that IT systems development at VA is a long-standing, high-risk challenge with projects susceptible to cost overruns, schedule slippages, and performance problems. In June 2012, VA awarded a contract with a $543 million ceiling to Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Services to deploy Rtls nationwide over the course of 5 years. The Rtls procurement and implementation process was a cooperative effort between VHA, the Office of Acquisitions and Logistics, and the Office of Information and Technology. VA was required by policy to manage the Rtls project under VA's Project Management Accountability System, which was a project management system intended to establish a discipline to ensure that an IT project's customer, project team, vendors, and stakeholders would focus on a single compelling mission, that is, achieving on-time project delivery. PMAS used incremental product build techniques with delivery of new functionality tested and accepted by the customer in cycles of 6 months or less. We received a complaint alleging VA management failed to comply with VA policy and guidance when it deployed Rtls assets without appropriate project oversight, and that Rtls assets were deployed without meeting VA information security requirements. We reported management failed to comply with VA policy and guidance when it deployed Rtls assets without appropriate project oversight. Specifically, the Rtls Project Management Office, or PMO, did not follow guidance from the Technical Acquisition Center to use an incremental project management approach during the acquisition and deployment of Rtls assets to compensate for known project management risks. Also, the Rtls PMO did not comply with VA policy requiring the use of PMAS for all acquisitions and delivery of Rtls assets. Despite the guidance from the Technical Acquisition Center and VA policy, the Rtls PMO did not ensure the vendor could meet contracted functionality requirements, such as accurate asset tracking, on the initial $7.5 million task order before ultimately committing a total of $431 million to the same vendor for further Rtls deployments. VA had awarded the initial task order to deploy Rtls in VISN 23 with an expected delivery date in December of 2013. However, initial operational testing in March 2015 identified 245 functionality defects that resulted in the issuance of a contract cure notice to the vendor. In June 2016, the cure notice was still unresolved as significant defects, including the inability of Rtls to meet contract requirements for asset tracking, remained outstanding. In September 2016, VHA renegotiated the Rtls contract due to the vendor's inability to implement the functional Rtls solution. The renegotiation was intended to expedite the implementation of RTLS in each VISN. VA executed a global settlement agreement that resulted in extensive changes to the vendor's contract requirements to include expiration of task orders, reduction in the scope of RTLS applications deployed, extension of the contract period of performance, and commitment of $431 million to the vendor as of December of 2016. According to the agreement, VA also released the contractor from any liability claims related to prior performance on the contract. We also substantiated the allegation that VA deployed RTLS assets without meeting VA's information security requirements. We reported inadequate oversight of RTLS risk management activities left VA mission-critical systems and data susceptible to unauthorized access, loss, or disclosure. Consequently, VA's internal network faced unnecessary risks resulting from untested RTLS system security controls. We reported VA must exercise cost control, sound financial stewardship, and discipline in RTLS development. As a result of inadequate project management, VA lacked assurance of an effective return on the $431 million invested in RTLS. We provided recommendations for improving controls over VA's oversight of system development projects, and VHA and OI&T concurred with our recommendations. Our review of the Rtls project demonstrates VA continues to face challenges in managing its IT development projects. VA has taken some actions to address issues we identified in our Rtls report and in other recent reports. However, it remains to be seen whether the actions will effectively improve VA's ability to meet cost, schedule, performance, and security goals when managing mission-critical system initiatives. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. We would be happy to answer any questions you or other members of the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Dahl. The written statements of those who have just provided oral testimony will be entered into the hearing record. We will now proceed to questioning. We'll begin. Ms. Rice, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to, I can't read any names. Mr. Dahl. So this is what I want to ask you about. The contract cure notice the VA had issued to Hewlett-Packard in 2015 was still unresolved by June of 2016, including RTLS's inability to meet fundamental contract requirements for asset tracking and software functionality. Instead of terminating the contract, it was renegotiated. HP's responsibilities were reduced by nearly 50%, and the vendor was released from any liability claims related to prior performance of the contract. Can you explain why the VA decided to renegotiate the contract with HP?
Well, I think VA may be better suited to answer that question. I would speculate that VA management...
Oh, yeah, you're the... I'm sorry, yeah.
I would speculate that VA management was concerned that the contractor was behind schedule and there were concerns as to whether they would be able to deliver the system on time and within costs.
Ms. Sarnecki, maybe you could...
Yes, there was a number of items that were, remember the RTLS was new in the medical space at that time. So there were a number of items that were in the contract that there was differencing of opinion between the contractor and VHA. For example, location accuracy. As Mr. Dahl stated, initially there was only a 40% location accuracy. So in the contract, we had placed that we needed to have location accuracy for asset tracking. Their definition of location accuracy and our definition was different. We needed clinical accuracy. We needed to know that piece of equipment was in that particular room so that we could go to that room, get that piece of equipment, and move it. So there were a number of clarifications so that the contractor wasn't necessarily wrong. There were definition differences between the contractor and VHA in a number of the areas. And so those needed to be clarified, and that was part of the change. The second piece of it is initially VHA went into the contract saying that if you were getting asset tracking, cath lab, and SPS, you had to have all of those installed and tested at the same time. Part of the settlement agreement is that we decoupled those so that each one of those applications were independent and could be tested and deployed.
So can you pinpoint how this mismanagement occurred and how the VA is going to ensure that this doesn't happen again? What I fail to see in all of these hearings that we have is any level of accountability. When you're talking about $500 million being spent on a system that was totally mismanaged, it doesn't seem like there was a proper protocol for how it was going to be implemented. I just don't understand. The process, maybe, is what I don't understand. Do you learn from these instances of mismanagement, and who's accountable?
So in this case, it takes 1 to 2 years to deploy the infrastructure. And as I stated, in this particular case, they were getting 2 applications, both asset tracking as well as sterile processing. And so when it went into testing, that was when we identified errors, not errors, but deficiencies, things that were not working the way we anticipated that they would work. And so, yes, we have learned from those. We issued a cure notice. We didn't do any further deployments until after the global settlement agreement. We continued the infrastructure work, but we didn't test or deploy anything further until we were sure that the contractor was able to meet the deliverables.
So the accountability?
I believe that there is accountability throughout the entire process. There was a senior level project manager, both from IT as well as VHA, that worked with the contracting or with the vendor. And I believe we held the vendor accountable as well as our own staff.
So how did you hold this staff accountable?
With the staff being held accountable, the staff were required to work through the process with the vendor. There was a list of items that needed to be negotiated, definitions to be clarified, and so I believe that we worked through those issues. I don't believe that there was any intention not to have a working, functional RTLS system, but this was new in the medical space at that time. It was the largest deployment of real-time tracking system in healthcare. It was a definition problem, and we've run into this before, where clinical people do not necessarily speak the same language as the business community, and those ended up not being performance issues, but rather clarification of requirements. These were there needed to be very clear definitions of what each and every requirement was, and I think that we have learned that as well. Going forward, as we talk about what does, and I'll use accuracy mean, there is a very big difference between what I think clinical accuracy is as a nurse and what the vendor thought accuracy was. The accuracy for them was it's in the director's suite. The accuracy for me, it's in the director's suite, it's in the director's office, it's in his cupboard.
We have to move on. The gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Dr. Dunn, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm welcome to the panel. I'm going to ask everybody to try to keep their answers concise because, as you can say, we're on the clock. So let me start with Ms. Zarnecki. In your testimony, you described site assessments that were conducted to determine where to implement or where to pilot Catamaran. How were those sites chosen, and in retrospect, were the chosen sites good choices?
I don't know how the sites were selected.
Okay, so in retrospect, would you say that we made good choices on site selection?
I do believe we made good choices in site selections. We chose a mix of both small and large facilities.
Okay, so now we know that the D.C. Medical Center actually had a lot of problems ahead of time. Logistically, they were struggling. Did the people managing these choices know that the D.C. Medical Center had trouble with logistics?
I do believe they knew that there were trouble with the logistics. They thought the Catamaran system would actually
So they
help
thought
them.
that was the solution. All right, so let's turn to the RTLS. Again, Ms. Zarnecki, you represent health, and Mr. Konstantin, you represent IT, I believe, right? All right, so this is a question for both of you. Who should have been in charge of the RTLS implementation from each of your organizations, and who actually was in charge?
I'll start with that one. RTLS is like a medical device, like an anesthesia monitor,
I know
or
it is.
A medical screen in the colonoscopy suite. So it was a mix of VHA and OINT. So there were components, there were 22 task orders.
So the question was who was supposed to be in charge, not what is
co-managed.
RTLS?
It's co-managed.
But so what, 50-50? Is there... Did you have the right people from your department, Mr. Konstantin, in charge, and did you, Ms. Zarnecki?
Yes, I had a senior level project manager who was certified in project management principles.
And the same guy actually did it. So it wasn't one person said, okay, and same for you?
Sir, we had a senior lead for this implementation. There was a departure. We filled the position later. There was a gap, but now we have a senior lead again in OINT.
Mr. Dahl, what would a well-run project look like in the VA or in the civilian world with this kind of implementation?
I would say especially as we've learned that this was new in the medical space, the RTLS, I think that perhaps following an incremental approach from the start may have been more prudent in that they probably should have made sure that it was the things that needed to be functional were functional before deploying elsewhere.
We've heard testimony that this is some novel technology in the healthcare space. I'm a physician. I've worked in a lot of hospitals in and out of the military. This is not that novel. I mean, we track millions of pieces of equipment through multiple hospital systems. Some of them are state, many of them are private. HCA type hospitals. This is not rocket science, and it's not something that hasn't been done. It is mature technology that's used throughout the business world. Walmart does it, Target does it, PetSmart does it. Why can't the VA do it? Maybe that's a question for Mr. Dahl. You're the one who inspects people and judges them, or go ahead.
Yeah, I do think VA has a capability of managing these kind of projects. They just chose a big bang approach as opposed to an agile incremental approach. If you break the project up into smaller pieces and get the end user involved early on, you discover early on whether or not your contract requirements are being met.
We've actually had this problem with the EMR as well, right? I mean, this is the same sort of failure to implement?
This is a theme that has showed up in various IT development projects over the years.
It has, and it's obviously it's a disappointment to see that we can throw away so many billions of dollars and actually tread water, not making any headway on that. My time is about to expire, so I will yield, but let the record reflect that it's disappointing that we can't implement mature technology in a agency that is so very well resourced. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Lamb, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Zarnecki, I have a question about the policies in place, if any, to identify potential conflicts of interest. In Pittsburgh, there was a former VA regional director who was identified by our local paper as having an advising role to SHIPCOM, which was one of the contractors that the VA hired to do the tracking in the Catamaran system. Can you tell me about any policies that would have caught that on the front end or that prevented it, or if they don't exist, has that ever discussed?
I'll need to take that one for the record. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if General Counsel reviewed that or not.
Okay. Are you aware of the incident that I'm talking about where the former regional director was?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Now, we were, I think, in the gentleman's previous question, we were just starting to get into the issue of coordination and project implementation between the VHA headquarters and regional VA systems. So I'm not sure which of the witnesses is best to answer this, but could somebody talk about going forward, what's the best way to allow the regional VA systems to have input into a policy or system change like this from the beginning so that they can actually implement it more successfully than was done here?
So the regions are called our VISNs, and our medical centers did in fact have input into the Rtls project as well as Catamaran. They're involved from a project management standpoint. Contracting officer representative is part, and then the staff do get to give us feedback and input. It's just like in trialing any other product where you would have your staff providing ongoing feedback.
Well, Mr. Bowman, from what you were saying, this wasn't done in an incremental manner, is that right? That's correct. Would you say that there's an opportunity to do that differently in the future by trying this maybe in one region and not others, or trying it? I mean, can you kind of address that issue?
So we recently received a corrective action plan in response to our report from VHA and OINT, and they laid out a case where they're using incremental methodologies to change the way they're deploying Rtls, such as breaking up the application into discrete functionality. That way they're not having to have so many interdependencies that they have to resolve. So that would be a case where they're changing their approach, and so far from what I hear, they're achieving success doing it that way.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Arrington, you're recognized for 5
minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to first of all congratulate my colleague, Mr. Lamb, on his election victory, and I look forward to getting to know you better, and we're glad you're on our committee, and honored to serve with you, so congratulations to you and your family. There is not a more perennial issue of disappointment to me in the lack of management of the big beast, bureaucratic beast of the VA than IT systems. I mean, I have heard this is I don't know how many stanzas of the same song, but it's getting really old. So I'm going to ask the same questions I ask at, it seems like every one of these meetings where we can't get IT systems right. But let's start by just answering this in a very simple way, in a very quick way, Ms. Zarnecki. What are we trying to achieve with Rtls? What happens to our customer if Rtls or these logistics management systems aren't in place? If they're not in place or they're not working, what happens to our customer, the veteran?
For Rtls, and I'll use sterile processing as the example, every single instrument is tracked to make sure that it is reprocessed appropriately. The trays are built, delivered to the right operating room for the right patient.
So potentially, if we don't get this right, they're not getting the right device or therapy to the right patient. It's that serious? I mean, that sounds like life or death. That's a public safety issue. Am I overstating it?
Potentially, we could miss a step in the reprocessing of sterilization.
So, I mean, we could have unsterilized equipment. I mean, this is serious, and we have our veteran patients who are coming in. Where do they go if they feel like this thing is just all jacked up and you just can't get it right? They don't have any confidence you can get it right? Where do they go? Where can they go to just so they can have peace of mind that a healthcare provider is actually going to take care of them and manage all these things so they get the right therapy, the right device, it's sterile, and it's well-suited to put them on the path of healing? Where do they go if you guys can't get it right?
I hate to say this, but it could happen in any healthcare system.
I know it could happen anywhere, but where would they go if they couldn't get it at the VHA? Do they have can they access other hospitals? I mean, who's competing for their business? Here's my point. Too many veterans are trapped in this system, and it's failing them. Who has been fired on account of losing hundreds of millions of dollars? Because that's what I'm hearing. We've lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Now I'm going to talk about the shareholder. We're fiduciaries for the taxpayers. Who has been fired on account of hundreds of millions of dollars? Because I can tell you, outside of the fantasy world of the VA, people would lose their jobs over that. How many people have been fired in this, the mismanagement of the Catamaran and the RTLS?
I really don't have that information.
I can tell you nobody's been fired, but I'll ask Mr. Dahl, maybe he knows. How many people were fired over this?
I'm not aware of anyone.
Nobody gets fired. I've asked that question. Colleagues, I've asked that question almost at every hearing, and they don't know. And then I asked to submit for the record. I've never received anything, so I assume that you never submitted it. There's no accountability. So this is, I almost feel like I'm wasting my time at these hearings. You say that these are jointly managed between the OIT and the VHA. So, you know the old saying, if multiple people are accountable, nobody's accountable. Who is ultimately accountable for information technology systems, the enterprise architecture? Who's ultimately responsible at the VA for all this?
Sir, the enterprise architecture is the responsibility of the Office of Information and Technology.
And who is the head of that office?
The Chief Information Officer.
And where is he or she?
At VA Central Office.
How long have they been in that office?
Mr. Sandoval was appointed acting in that role 2, maybe 3 weeks ago.
2 or 3 weeks ago. I think there's a real issue with continuity over there, but there's certainly an issue of accountability. I know I've gone over my time. I'm not even close to finishing, so I hope we get more opportunities. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Peters, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I share Mr. Arrington's frustration. I will say that we voted for the Accountability Act here in order to give more flexibility for hiring and firing. And I did that in good faith. And what I saw was that the people who've been fired are cooks and gardeners. And those people didn't cost anything close to millions of dollars. And I think that I feel a little bit taken advantage of because that was not the intent of the vote that I took. It was the intent was to get to things like this. And I would just say, too, you know, when you were testifying about the mismatch between what doctors say and what IT people say, that's not the first time we've heard this. And I was trying to remember what it was. It was a medical surgical prime vendor program, too. And I'd maybe direct this to Mr. Dahl. What is the appropriate response for the department to take so that when we do these are novel contracts, but you know you can lose $5 million before you lose $500 million. What should they be doing up front to make sure that these people are speaking the same language, and if they're not, that we catch it early and we don't spend so much money, waste so much money down the line that we're having a hearing like this?
In this case, the approach was they awarded that initial task order where they were going to deploy this in a VISN. It was a $7.5 million task order. So in theory,
right,
that would seem like a reasonable approach. But that was due, they awarded that task order in 2012. It was due to be completed in 2013, late 2013. They didn't get to operational testing on that until March of 2015. So they had already slipped about 15 months. That's when they identified some deficiencies. But in the meantime, they had been awarding additional task orders before they knew that it was functional in VISN, in that VISN. I know that, I assume that there was a desire to get this RTLS up and running across the enterprise, but with this unproven technology, we really believe that they should have been taking a more incremental approach.
It's just gasoline on the fire. I mean, we would all be upset if they lost $7.5 million, right? But before figuring out whether this would work, before figuring out whether the doctors and the IT people were speaking the same language, we went and deployed the same thing over and over again, even though it was behind schedule. That's what happened, right? So a little bit of a loss what to do now. I mean, we're going to be under the gun on the budgets. We're now the Congress is talking about spending $1 trillion a year in deficits in good times, and we can't have this kind of money wasted. We got nothing for this, and I know we're still paying for this, right? Is that right, Mr. Dahl?
Yes, as Mr. Bowman noted, we did recently get an action plan from VHA and OINT, a response to our recommendations. They're portraying to us that they're making that they have gone to a more incremental approach and they are making progress. Of course, we haven't done any follow-up on that yet to validate or verify that.
We probably can't blackball this contractor either, I don't suppose, can we, because of the process concerns about that, right?
I would have to defer to probably the Office of Acquisition and Logistics on that, whether there's grounds for that.
Well, $500 million, $420 million, or whatever it is. I guess I think we're being taken advantage of. I think taxpayers are being taken advantage of. I'm a big fan of the VA. I would not describe the VA as a failure. I think it gets overstated sometimes, but this is really outrageous. And I just like the fact that I've heard this same song about the doctors not being able to speak the same language as the IT people. One, I've heard of that in other contexts. That's a management issue. That's a cultural issue that you've recognized. You got to get a hold of. You can't do this again. And the fact that we spent $7 million to figure out if it worked, and no one could wait to figure out if it was working. You know, it's just shameful to spend that kind of money, and especially when we all know it's novel. So please don't come back to me again with this kind of stuff. And as to the Accountability Act, I would say, you know, this is exactly what this is meant for, not for cooks and gardeners. It's outrageous that my vote was taken advantage of in that way, because it's the middle management that's the problem in the VA, to the extent there's a problem in the VA and it's not being dealt with. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Poliquin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. This nice staff right in front of you. Can you get back a little bit so I can make sure I can see everybody at the table? Thank you very much. Mr. Dahl, make sure I get this straight. Make sure I understand this. You're in the IG's office, right? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So you've got the VA that's trying to figure out how to control and keep track of their inventory, right? Okay. So roughly around 2012, they implement, or they start to implement, a Catamaran system, right? It's one of these systems, right? And then within a year, they implement a second system called Rtls. Is that correct, roughly?
I think it's the other way around.
Okay, okay, but you understand my point. Okay. And first of all, Ms. Sarnecki, why would you implement two programs or two systems, start them at effectively the same time? Why? Tell me.
This was during a time where we were trying to transform, and we had what we called T21 initiatives, and these were two different initiatives. One was for the supply chain. The other was sterile processing, cath lab, asset tracking.
Could you combine them together? In hindsight, could you have done that?
I'm not sure the technology would have been able to combine those together.
Who made that decision to have two programs going forward?
I believe that was made at a leadership level.
Okay.
These were all projects that were...
Dennis, you're going to make sure that we get this from your office, who that person was. I want to know if that person is still at the VA, and if so, I want to speak to that person. Okay. Let's go down the path here a little bit more. This has been discussed a moment ago. I think, Mr. Dahl, you mentioned it. I think Mr. Peters did too. To start this thing off, you spent about $7.5 million of taxpayer money to see if this thing would work. And then with a short period of time, you found out it wouldn't, but then you expanded it anyway to 19 different sites, right? And you spent about $430 million to do that. And the thing was a complete failure, right? Okay, who made that decision?
I believe that the Deputy Undersecretary for Health made the decision to go ahead.
Okay, who's that person?
That person would have been Bill Schoenhardt.
Okay, Dennis, you want to make sure that we know this fellow. We want to get him on the phone if he's still at the VA. Okay, is that person still at the VA?
No, sir.
Okay, where's that person?
That person's retired.
Okay, how about the other person I mentioned? Is that person at the VA? The first person we mentioned, was that person at the VA?
No, that person's not at VA.
Retired also?
I believe deceased.
Okay. All right, let me ask you this. When this mess that has happened over the past 5 or 10 years, which has cost about, I think Mr. Peters said about $400 million, roughly, okay? there's a settlement agreement with the Rtls Contractor, correct? Who negotiated that settlement agreement?
That was negotiated between Dr. Stone and Hewlett-Packard.
Who's Dr. Stone?
Dr. Stone at that time was the Principal Deputy Undersecretary.
Okay, is he still with the VA?
No, he's not.
Where is he?
He left the VA about a year and a half ago.
Where is he now?
I don't know.
Okay, you're going to find out. Dennis will find out. Okay. Why, Mr. Dahl, have you taken a look at this agreement with a contractor?
No, I don't believe, like the chairman said, I don't believe that we've seen the entire agreement. I think we may have seen pieces of it, but VA has not shared that agreement.
Why not? Okay. Do we have, Jack, we have subpoena power here, don't we, Mr. Chairman? Do you need help getting that contract? Do you have subpoena power?
We have subpoena power.
So what's the problem?
We reported on the result of that global settlement agreement, how it led to a decrease in the scope of the project, and that was what we reported.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So the vendor who screwed this whole thing up and the folks within the VA that allowed this to happen and hired the vendor in the beginning, now you're going through a settlement agreement after we've lost $400 million and you can't get the complete terms of the settlement agreement. Is that right? So we don't know if the folks that screwed this up have been given more time and less liability, correct?
Our understanding is they've been relieved of reliability for any issues that happened before the settlement.
Okay, so let me get this straight. So they've lost $400 million of taxpayer money, which has put some of our veterans at risk from a health standpoint, and we've relieved them of liability going forward, or the liability that they could have incurred going backwards.
It may not be an accurate statement to say.
But we don't know because we don't have the contract, right?
No, what I'm saying is I'm not sure it's an accurate statement to say that we lost the entire $430 million. I think VA has gained some value from this system. It's just hard for us to assess.
How much?
I couldn't answer that question.
Okay, but we need that settlement agreement, don't we?
You may find it interesting.
Good. Who do we get it from? Mr. Zarnecki, do you have that contract?
Logistics.
We'll get you a copy.
Do you have the contract?
Do I have the contract?
Who signed the contract? Did you sign the contract?
No, I did not.
Who signed the contract?
Dr. Stone.
Who's no longer with the VA. Okay, but we have a copy of the contract somewhere. You got
Yes,
it
somewhere we have a copy of the contract.
Okay, good. We're going to make sure Dennis gets a contract, and we're going to make sure Mr. Dahl gets a contract. Is there any reason why we can't get that contract, Mr. Dahl?
I missed that, sir.
Any reason why we can't ask for it? Am I not supposed to ask for the contract?
No, I would think it would be well within your rights.
Okay, have you asked for the contract?
Did we ask for it?
Did you ask for it?
Yes, we did.
And who said no?
We did ask
and
for
who
the
said
global
no?
settlement agreement.
And who said no?
I believe that we got a majority of it. Not sure if we got the complete settlement agreement.
Who said no? Who decided to withhold how much of that contract? Who was it?
Could we take that for the record, please? We can give you a more accurate response.
This is unbelievable. I'm not even sure I want to yield back my time. I'm having fun doing this. What a mess. Anybody embarrassed here? We got 7 million veterans we're trying to take care of. We got a budget that's gone up from, I don't know, from 90 million to 187, billion to 187 billion over 8 years. We can't keep track of stethoscopes and tongue depressors. We're losing our pants on deals, and then after the deal, after we find out we've lost it all, we relieve them of responsibility. This is unbelievable. I yield back my time, but before I do, want to make it short clear, we want that contract. Thank you.
Thank you. In case you haven't figured out, any of you testified in the last 18 months before this panel before?
No, sir.
Yes, sir, I have.
You know probably what I'm about to say because you've heard it before, the lack of a sense of urgency in all accounts. And the point is we are living one more example here of that, the need for the sense of urgency on the part of everyone within the VA, because when the men and women who serve our country in uniform, they have a sense of urgency in what they do, and shame on anyone especially in the VA or on this committee, who doesn't have that same sense of urgency when it comes to meeting those veterans' needs and getting it done right. I'll claim my time here for my 5 minutes. Ms. Zarnecki, I'd like to start with the money question. How much was spent on the Catamaran point-of-use project up until its termination, and how much has been spent on RTLS to date? What's the total?
So Catamaran is still going through an equitable adjustment, but so far 117 million. And for RTLS, we have obligated 360 million.
Okay. So you said 117 or 171 million?
I believe we have so far paid out 117 million.
Okay. Now, we know how much we've paid out. How much additional funding is going to be necessary to finish RTLS?
My understanding is that we are ending this contract, so it'll be roughly around 360 million.
So another 360
No,
million?
no, total. We've already obligated 360 million. We are finishing the work on this contract.
So no more monies, we're just terminating, finishing the contract?
Right, that's my understanding.
Okay. So no more funds expended?
No more funds expended. We will be looking at our return on investment and the business cases of the equipment that has been deployed, the applications that have been deployed, to determine if we want to further expand.
Okay, so you're just terminating the contract when it expires?
We are ending the
renewing it?
contract. Right,
Okay.
not renewing.
Okay, again, Ms. Zarnecki, I understand that the chief logistics officers in the VISNs inspect the medical center's logistics departments annually, is that correct?
Yes, they do.
Okay, so it's also my understanding that VISN 5 did not conduct any logistics inspections in D.C., of the D.C. facility in 2016 or 2017. That was during the OIG's investigation when the supply issue was under intense scrutiny. How do you explain the fact when there's a lot of bad things, there's things going on that you can see, why weren't there inspections?
There was actually an inspection done in 2017 by the program office. We actually had people from the program office who staffed the DC Medical Center through November of 2017. Their staffing was down to 40% of what they should have had.
Okay. Well, I tell you what was the result of the inspection?
They were not, in fact, using the Catamaran system. They did not have an inventory management system. They were not using GIP. They were using paper systems.
So basically, they weren't complying with any of the directives. I mean, who was accountable? That was determined during an inspection. Were the people in charge on a daily basis monitoring the fact that they weren't doing what they were supposed to be doing with RTLS or Catamaran or whatever else?
The chief logistics officer at the medical center would have been ultimately responsible. The medical center director was aware of the issues as well. Both of them have since been removed from their positions. Removed
as in still employed by the VA, or removed and terminated?
The medical center director was terminated. I believe the chief of logistics was also terminated, but I'm not positive if he voluntarily left or if he was terminated.
Okay. Mr. Dahl, your colleagues in the Office of Inspector General conducted the investigation at the Washington, D.C. Medical Center's logistics and supply practices. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, there seem to be varying accounts as to the extent Catamaran was ever used there at all. What did your office observe?
The team that was there determined that Catamaran was never fully used at the DC Medical Center, and that prior to the Catamaran, they weren't using the JIP fully before the transition to Catamaran as well.
So they were a little bit behind the power curve, as we might say in flying already, why would we even consider choosing them if they're already struggling to do their day-to-day operations? Why would we choose them as a pilot site or a test site if they don't have their act together on the front end?
We thought that installing the Catamaran system would actually assist them. The ShipCom organization came in and built the inventory system for them. So you did utilize it for a very short period of time, but it's something that you need to maintain. And as soon as folks were not paying as much attention, they quit maintaining the system and went back to their paper system.
Okay. I see my time has expired here. I'm going to ask my colleagues. Does anyone would like a second round of questions? You good? Okay. I'm going to ask one final one here as I go into the closing remarks. I heard you mention that in trying the Catamaran system or RTLS, there was nothing like this that existed in the healthcare system in hospitals around the country, outside of federally run. So why would VA try to eat this elephant, if you will, in one bite without having any reference point to start from as far as success or failures in whether it be Humana, pick your hospital, chain that is run around the country. Why would VA gamble the valuable limited taxpayers' dollars focused on the veterans? Why would they gamble on being a lab for this? What was the risk management involved with that?
So Catamaran is an integrator of software. Automated supply chain systems do exist and have existed in private sector. Perhaps this wasn't the best choice for us. We had made an incorrect assumption that was a COTS product, it was off the shelf, and that we would be able to implement it fairly easily. That did not happen. RTLS was kind of new for the healthcare space back in 2010. It's being used widely now to manage sterile processing, cath labs, track patients, track providers, frankly. So I know where a doctor is, whether he's in the OR or whether he's in clinic. So I think that VA wanted to be on cutting edge and make sure that our veterans had the latest technology. We have received benefit from the RTLS system. We are seeing cost savings every day in our cardiac cath labs, our sterile processing. Is the VA, given the fact of maybe its decentralized nature of some of the operations, and the fact that I think we've seen before that some of the VISNs don't necessarily coordinate and talk with one another, and when you put test sites together or pilot programs together, unless you focus the group and hold the people accountable for that mission of here's what we're trying to accomplish, here are our timelines, here are the metrics that we're trying to achieve, it would seem to me that the VA is not the place capable of doing as complex a technology project as this, and therefore, because it's not the right place, the veterans' care potentially suffers much more than it should. So I guess it concerns me that we are trying to do too much when we may not have the expertise and the tight coordination to actually assess the results of what it is we're trying to achieve. So I would ask that you would submit for the record any and all disciplinary action taken as a result of poor performance relating to the Catamaran and RTLS projects so that we know who, in fact, was held accountable for those failures. With that, I'd like to thank the witnesses for your testimony. The panel is now excused.
The failure of the Catamaran point-of-use system and the rocky experience with the RTLS to date should serve as cautionary tales. What the two efforts have in common, beyond both being logistics technology projects, is that they are complex collaborations between Veterans Health Administration and the Office of Information and Technology. Nearly everything VA does in the medical arena relies on software, and most of the department's software impacts that medical care. In RTLS specifically, many of the problems encountered were not just the result of the two organizations struggling to cooperate, they were the result of VHA deliberately avoiding OI&T and its processes. Although the events in question took place several years ago, this sort of friction, the natural friction between bureaucracies, between VHA and OI&T, has been an issue since OI&T was first established in 2006. We have to get it right because the stakes are dramatically increasing. The Electronic Health Records Modernization Program, which we have been awaiting since last year, is perhaps the largest medical information technology collaboration in the history of the federal government. Its scope and its scale is challenging enough, and the VA cannot afford this sort of organizational infighting. The committee is committed to exercising vigorous oversight of the Cerner implementation. We are united on this issue. This is bipartisan. This morning, we approved H.R. 4245 in markup, the EHRM Oversight Act. I'm proud to co-sponsor the legislation with Ranking Member Walz, Chairman Rowe, and Ranking Member Custer. I believe that the many lessons learned through the RTLS project are directly applicable to the Electronic Health Records Modernization. RTLS, without a doubt, produced some tangible benefits despite its setbacks. And by all means, it is preferable to learn these lessons in a $500 million project, that's $500 million with a B, before taking on the $16 billion project. But VA cannot, I repeat, cannot repeat the same mistakes again. That will be totally unacceptable. We will continue to monitor the RTLS as it enters what I hope are its final months, not years. I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous material. Without objection, so ordered. I would once again like to thank my colleagues and all our witnesses and the audience members for joining us here this afternoon. With that, the hearing is now adjourned.